Hello, this is Marcos Patchett, the Nocturnal Herbalist, and this video is called The Magic of Cacao, and it's a talk I did in August 2021 just about the traditional magical meanings and mythology of cacao, Theobroma cacao used to make chocolate. And when I say traditional, I mean traditional in Mesoamerica, that's Central America, what is today known as Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, Costa Rica, that part of the world. So yeah, just the talk will be in four sections. So and each of those sections builds to form a coherent sort of picture. So there are four sections to this talk. The first section is going to be about the traditional beverages made with cacao beans. And by traditional, I mean traditional in Mesoamerica, in Central America, often dating from before the 16th century, before the time of the Spanish conquest. But many of them are still drunk in Central America today. The second section, Theobroma Pharmacy, is going to talk about the pharmacology of cacao and how that may link in to its magical uses and properties and uses in ritual, particularly before the Spanish conquest in native belief systems. The third part of the talk, Stella Cacao, is about how cacao fits in to indigenous star lore. Like every society the world around, traditional Mesoamerican societies such as the Mexica, later renamed the Aztecs, or the Maya, the different Maya peoples, had an extensive astrological lore which tied in with their religious and mythological sort of belief systems, and cacao fit in with those, and that section of the talk will talk about that. And then the final section of the talk, part 4, will talk about how cacao featured in the mythology of their gods and how it was also used in ancestor worship. And then finally, all of these things will be tied together to give a comprehensive sense of how cacao fit in to indigenous belief systems and may have been used for magical purposes traditionally, and even may be used in that way today by esotericists. So hopefully this will be enjoyable. Just a quick word about the sound quality in this video. It's not wonderful just because I forgot to record. I do this very often when I'm giving talks. I completely forget to actually switch on the microphone, just because I'm so focused on giving the talk, I forget to switch things on and do practical things of that nature. So fortunately, one of the people who was coming to the talk, Monica, actually recorded the talk on her phone. So thank you to Monica for that, and shout out to Monica. Hello. So thank you for recording it, because otherwise there wouldn't be any audio. So I've scrubbed that up and amplified it as best I can. It's a little echoey, but hopefully it's still good. So anyway, enjoy the talk. Most of the traditional beverages we think were made from fermented seeds, but there are two kinds of seeds still in use in Central America now in contemporary beverages. One's just cacao, normal cacao, which is fermented and then toasted. And the other is called cacao lavado, or washed cacao, which means it's just piled up for a day and then washed. So it's fermented a tiny little bit and then it's washed. And that makes a big difference to the taste and to the pharmacology. And basically the washed cacao has more of the antioxidants in, it has more polyphenols in, which I'll go on to talk about in a bit, because they're really important for how it affects you and for the health and for your health and everything. But it has less of these other little constituents like the trace amines, like serotonin and dopamine, and all these little trace chemicals that affect your brain. So it's interesting. It probably only is of great interest to nerds like me, but I do think that is that's a really interesting thing to try and find out. My suspicion is that probably anciently it was more like most of the cacao had maybe be made from this cacao lavado, which is just fermented for a day or so. So it doesn't break down as much of the antioxidants, but it's still producing some of those little trace chemicals. All right, so, and this is, you're probably all familiar with this tool, but the metate mano, it's just that's obviously the Spanish name for it. The Mexica, the Aztecs called it a metatl, which is the grinding stone, and the metlapil, which is the roller bit. And it's just an old style quern, which is a stone grinding thing. What's distinctive about the Mesoamerican or Central American grinding apparatus is that it's got this slightly concave surface and they're usually made of volcanic stone or granite, and they're really good for grinding cacao on, because obviously when you grind cacao seeds, because they have so much fat in them, they're 50% fat, they go to liquid, they turn into cacao liquor. So the fact that they're concave like that just means that the liquid all collects in the center of it. Nice. And they're usually heated. I mean, sometimes they'll put like coals underneath them, but in Mexico, if you just leave them in the sun, it's like they're hot enough. And then because they're hot, obviously they're above the melting temperature of cocoa butter, which we all know about that, it's chocolate on a hot day. So because they're heated like that, when you're grinding them on these flat surfaces, very different from a mortar and pestle, which is like a big bowl, it's much better for grinding the liquid because you spread it out over in a flat thing like that. So what tends to happen is a lot of the acids from the fermentation evaporate, and it mellows the flavour, and it just turns it into a superior product doing it that way rather than doing it. And also doing it in a mortar and pestle, if you're going to hand grind beans, is a guaranteed way to get RSO. I don't recommend it. Do you know what I mean? Because it really knackers your wrist up, and you don't get that same surface area for evaporation. Anyway, that was the traditional. They use that for grinding corn and spices and pretty much everything. Like every traditional kitchen in Central America has one of those. Right. Okay. So this is 3 photos from contemporary Mesoamerica. That's just the one on this side and the far side. They're both from the same kitchen of a chef called Karina Santiago in Oaxaca, which is on the west coast of Mexico. It's Mexico's most famous sort of culinary region, and she runs a restaurant called Tierra Antigua, or Old Earth, and they just do recipes which are traditional, ancient sort of Mesoamerican recipes. It's brilliant, and like post-colonial as well as pre-colonial, just traditional food. And this is her like on her comal, which is the flat dish, just toasting the cacao seeds. They were always toasted traditionally. So raw cacao, I'm not against it. I think it's a great thing, but the traditional thing was toasting the seeds lightly, which I'll go on to when I talk about the pharmacology, what that might do. I think it's important. It's a part of the process. There was a reason they did it. I usually, when you find, when you're looking at something, that traditionally there was a way things were done. Yeah, sometimes tradition is wrong, and it's good to question why, but usually there's a reason, even if you don't agree with the reason, usually there's a reason why people did that thing that way. And I think it's always a good thing to assume that there is a reason why it was done that way first, before you question it. Because I think sometimes in like today, people look at traditional knowledge or processes or whatever, and they assume the opposite. They assume like, well, that's probably wrong. They were probably stupid and they didn't know what they were doing. And I tend to assume that the assumption is, start with the opposite assumption and then work backwards. Do you know what I mean? If you think, oh, well, actually this is wrong, it's a better way of doing it, fair dues. But it's this massive hubris thing. It's like, I read this book a while ago, which referred to some forms of modern inquiry as a state of chronic general ingratitude, and I really like that. It's just like, because it can be a bit like that. Anyway, so there I'll talk about some of the pharmacology of what happens when you toast the seeds a bit later. And this is in the same restaurant. This is one of her helpers. That's not Karina. That's one of the ladies who's helping her, and she's grinding the cacao seeds. And she's actually, this little bowl with white stuff there. That's cacao blanco, which is a close relative of cacao. It's another tree called Theobroma bicolor, or jaguar tree. The seeds have less caffeine in, they're milder, and they're much paler, because cacao seeds, when you cut them open when they're raw, they're mauve or pink, sometimes light pink, sometimes ivory, sometimes mauve. They shade from sort of like just tinted to mauve. These are always white in the middle because they've got less polyphenols, less of the antioxidants in, and they have a milder, nuttier taste. Close relative. And these are in Oaxaca. There's a really insane process for producing these. They bury all these seeds in a pit in the ground for 6 months and fill it with water, and then they ferment them anaerobically for 6 months, and halfway through, after 3 months, they take everything out, like turn the seeds over, and they properly stink, and then they cover them back over again. And when they take them out after 6 months, all the odour is gone because the bacteria have done all their work. And the insides of them are just pure white, and they look like little lumps of rubbery feta cheese with a little skin on them. And then they're dried in the shade, not in the sun. It's really particular. In the shade on a dry day, just leave them in the shade in a covered porch until they're dried. and then you take the skins off, and they're used specifically in the recipe that this lady's making, which is chocolate atole. She's making this chocolate atole, which is this gruel of maize with this chocolate foam on top. And I'll talk about the foam in a bit, because all the traditional beverages had a head of foam on top, and that was really significant, both symbolically, ceremonially, magically, and possibly pharmacologically as well. But so she's grinding the cacao beans with this cacao blanco, and the function of this cacao blanco, this fermented seed, which is a relative of cacao that's held underground for 6 months and then has this really laborious process to make it, is as a foaming agent. It generates the foam when you grind it with cacao and then whip it up with water. And then the lady in the middle is a lady in another part of Oaxaca, Juchitán, and she's just winnowing the seeds. She's actually Senora Vasquez. She's a vendor of bupu, which is one of these foamy beverages they make in Juchitán, and it's made with cacao and magnolia flowers. And it's a big bowl of foamy cacao, and she's just winnowing the seeds, which is when she's toasted the seeds, she shelled the seeds, and then she pours them just through a colander on a windy day, and all the shells just blow away in the wind.
Wow.
So it's a quick way of separating out all the remaining bits of shell.
Amazing.
Yeah. So, and that's Doña Vasquez selling the bupu. You can see there's a big bowl of like foamy. Yeah. So it's got the atole, which is the warm beverage just made with toasted corn and water and not very sweetened, and then the foam on the top, which is cacao, magnolia flowers, both fresh and dried. And magnolia flowers obviously have this amazing smell to it, but also add a little bit of pharmacology, like they're anti-anxiety, they're relaxant, they reduce palpitations. So they contain the flowers of Mexican magnolia, Magnolia grandiflora, and the process is you grind you get loads of the fresh flowers and you grind them to a paste, and then grind them in with the toasted cacao, and then you've also got some dried flowers, which have been sun dried, that are also ground to a powder and mixed in with that. You need a bit of both. And these recipes have been obviously developed over centuries, and there are literally hundreds of different atoles and beverages utilizing cacao in Mesoamerica. Most of them are atoles, most of them are these corn-based recipes, just because cacao is expensive and corn is cheap, and corn is obviously the basic subsistence food. So adding cacao to it adds nutrition, adds a bit of pharmacology, gives you a bit of lift in your day, and it's just sustaining tonic. It's a way of padding it out. You know.
Fills you up.
Yeah, it fills you up. Exactly.
There's a bit of quality on it as well.
Exactly, both of those things. So it adds medicine and quality and flavour and niceness. But so it's a bit like that's the staple food. But this is a nice little beverage of the region. Nowadays it's made with loads of piloncillo, which is unrefined sugar, because you see the Spanish influence coming through in cinnamon, which obviously is from Sri Lanka originally, but the Spanish brought that in, and that supplanted a lot of local spices, in the addition of milk, which is never used in these traditional beverages, but is nowadays used in hot chocolate in Mexico and Central America, because milk again is a European import, and sugar. Sugar's the big one, because before the Spanish conquest, most of those ancient beverages were just made with water, cacao, spices, and herbs. They did add honey sometimes. Some of the recipes were sweetened, but most pre-Columbian cacahuatl or cacao, cacahuatl was the Mexica name, cacao is the Maya name, one of the Maya names for it, but cacao is one of the oldest names for it, K-A-K-A-W-A in like phonetic spelling. Most of those beverages were not sweetened at all. And then this is the chocolate atole, that's the finished chocolate atole. And again, you see with both of them, this is big head of cacao flavoured froth on top of the beverages. Sorry. So anyway.
Sorry, so underneath that froth is
the gruel of the corn, and it's like a
porridge.
Yeah, it's not. It's thin. It's a drink. Okay. But it's kind of more like a soup, a savoury soup. It's a bit like a Horlicks, right? Do you know what I mean, or something like that? Yeah. It's kind of. I know. Sorry to swear, but it's actually really pleasant. It's just like a thin gruel. These used to be really popular in medieval Europe. It's like peasant food for the whole world. Gruels or pottage. In medieval Europe, same thing. Do you know what I mean? That's where the word comes from. Pottage or gruel was just like ground up grain of some sort for your carbohydrate, bit of protein, just keep you going through the day. And then that would usually be breakfast and lunch, and then dinner people would have a proper meal. Do you know what I mean? And that's how it works still in a lot of Central America. Yeah. Okay, so Right, okay. So that is one of my favourite traditional cacao containers. That's a Mayan, a classic era Mayan, probably around 600 to 900 CE, lock top vessel. It's groovy. That actually has a little click lock. So you click it and the top clicks into place. They've made a thread on it, which is awesome. It's just handmade ceramic. So that was for storing made cacao beverage, so pre-made cacao beverage. So you grind your beans, you toast and grind, toast, shell, grind, mix with the spices, whip it up with water, whack it in there, ready for the feast. And then you've got your little lock top that will click on. We know it was used for cacao because chemical analysis shows that there are traces of theobromine in it, which is one of the alkaloids that's found in cacao, and because it actually says it in Maya hieroglyphics on the side. And I'll show you the hieroglyph for cacao later on, but it says this was used for storing cacao. And on the different Maya vessels of this type, we know that they made so many different variations of these beverages. There's one for tree fresh cacao, green cacao, honey cacao, pink cacao, white cacao, black cacao, and just like all these different, which were obviously different culinary variations made with different spices. And a lot of those recipes, we have no clue what they are. We can reconstruct a few because there are a few from the later Aztecs or the Mexica at the time of the Spanish conquest that were written down, but most of them weren't written down. And the Maya, obviously the classic Maya, this civilization peaked from sort of like 600 to 900 CE, and by the time of the Spanish conquest in the 1550s, most of their empires had sort of broken down. So anyway, this is Karina Santiago whipping the froth for the chocolate atole. As I say, all these traditional recipes have a big head of foam, all the atoles, and all the cacao recipes that we know that were made in ancient times and depictions on pottery and whatnot show a big head of foam. And most of those ancient recipes, while I'm sure they made atoles with cacao, most of the royal ones were made with just cacao, spices and water. They weren't made with maize because maize was, like, as I say, staple food, but cacao had a bit more cachet, and it depends where you were in Mesoamerica. So the Maya region, which is like the Yucatan region, it's nearer to the border of modern day Guatemala, or actually in Guatemala and Belize and Honduras. That's sort of a bit lower down towards South America. That region is more tropical and more wet, and particularly in some of the coastal areas, like towards the west and east coasts, like modern day Tabasco in South Mexico, and this whole strip down South Mexico and Guatemala, which is called the Soconusco region. Those regions, you grow cacao. So because cacao grew in Maya regions, it wasn't quite as expensive. Like, people could grow it for themselves. They could grow cacao in their back gardens, and therefore they were more likely to have consumed it with maize as well as on its own.
To beef it up, yeah.
Yeah, to beef it up, and as well as have the posh beverages just with the cacao and the water and whatever. In the Mexica, however, in modern day Mexico City, where Tenochtitlan, where, you know, because Mexico City is built on the old site Tenochtitlan, the Mexica capital, they're right in the arid central heartland of Mexico. So they had to carry cacao for thousands of miles over land in trade caravans. And they didn't have draft animals. There were no horses before the Spanish arrived. So these were humans carrying it on their backs. And to be a merchant was a really dangerous job because you had to go through enemy territory and whatever. And merchants kind of like doubled up as spies for the empire. So they'd go and like check out another little territory and see if it was ready to be invaded or whatever. So for them, the beans were really expensive. And you probably know about this. They used the beans as currency. The Mexica did. So they're using a small coin. So like 6 beans would buy you, like 2 beans would buy you a turkey, 100 beans would buy you a human slave, kind of thing. They were like very expensive, as in they were used to buy stuff. And they weren't drunk by the poor people. And for the Mexica in that part of Mexico, modern day Mexico, it was actually against the law for common people to drink cacahuatl. It was only reserved for the nobility, for the royal family. And warriors, obviously, because it was a really theocratic, militaristic state. And because the Mesoamericans, because we're talking about a few thousand years of history, there were various different civilizations. When we talk about the Maya, we're really talking about lots of different groups. The Maya wasn't one coherent empire, there were lots of different ones. They all used cacao. They all had a similar, we think, theocratic structure, like their state was very much built around the religion that they followed. But the Aztecs who came later were much more militaristic, and they actually unified the territory by conquering their neighbours and sort of subjecting them. So it's a really interesting history that anyway.
Suppression, wherever you go.
Yes, yeah. And when I get onto the metaphysics of cacao, which I won't, because all of this is in my book, which took me 14 years to write and therefore is yay thick. I've got a copy, I'll bring it in later on so you can have a look at it. Because I brought one, I forgot to bring it. But there's a lot in there, and I talk about how cacao might fit into empire, because when you look at the history of this substance, it's always been associated with luxury. It's always been associated with some of the darker sides of its associations have always been sort of slavery and empire. Yeah. And I wonder why that is, because it's like every plant drug, every substance, every being has its own affinities. And I think cacao is generally a benign substance and a helpful substance, but there's something about it that has an affinity for those things. Maybe. We'll talk about that later, because I'll bring in some other ideas later on.
Can we allow Marcus?
Yeah, I'll talk about it later on, but yeah, it's a fascinating thing for sure. All right, so these are just two recreations that I've done, attempted recreations of traditional beverages. They aren't 100% authentic because we don't have the recipes verbatim. There's only a couple that are verbatim, but for making these, I just used traditional Mesoamerican ingredients, processes that are still used in the atoles today, and processes that are described by the Spanish chroniclers after the conquest of how the inhabitants, the indigenous people, did things. So this is just the basic. That's just beans, cacao beans, indigenous spices, water, whipped up. So very much like what you prepared for us this morning, Anita, but obviously just using the Mesoamerican spices and no sweetening. So it's got a bit of magnolia flower, allspice, vanilla, chili. These are all indigenous to Mesoamerica. They were all used with cacao, and we know that they were because the Spanish chroniclers took accounts of the natives saying that they were used in the court. And another spice called Rosita de Cacao, and then this one with this mutant head of foam on the top here, that I used the cacao blanco, those little fermented seeds from Oaxaca, to generate that like big old head of foam.
Drop a fairy liquid in there?
That's right, yeah, drop a fairy liquid. That'd do it just as well. I mean, if you don't mind the vomiting and the gastritis, that would work just fine. But you say that, but when I was going around Mexico, there was one of the traditional atoles which foams there called popo. And one of the ladies who made it, and they made it with a different foaming agent, because there are various ones, as you can imagine, in different regions. Like one place they used the stems of sarsaparilla, that's sometimes used to make soft drinks. They used the roots to make soft drink, sarsaparilla, but they used the stems of a type of fresh sarsaparilla that's toasted, and then that makes a foaming agent. Another one, they use this vine called the milkweed vine, and there are two different varieties, and they use the sap of that. And it's one of the varieties of this milkweed vine. They use the peel or the bark of the stem, and it's called chupipe in this on the east coast in Tabasco. And one of the ladies who made it said, "Oh yeah, we had some neighbours up the road, and they didn't have any, so they used fairy liquid in their drink, and they sold it, and loads of people got really sick." And it was just like, yeah. So you say that, but can you imagine? Anyway, whatever. So yes. So onto the pharmacology. So I'm just going to do the basics here, because like in the book I've got like pages and pages of tables, and I do a 55-page monograph in the appendix for anyone who wants to get really geeky about it, because I'm a bit obsessive about it and I wanted to go into it in detail. But broadly speaking, the main groups of compounds I put in terms of the active bits, because obviously you've got a lot of different fats, and then some proteins, and then your carbohydrates or sugars, which make up any seed or nut or whatever. But then you've got these guys. So you've got the polyphenols, which are about 4% of the bean's dried weight. The polyphenols are the brown stuff when it's toasted. They're what turns it brown, and they're the antioxidants. Yeah. So what antioxidants do, because you hear about them a lot, they're obviously in loads of different fruits and vegetables and foods. Oxidation is something that happens when you just burn energy. When you breathe oxygen and you combine it with sugars in your cells, that process called cellular respiration produces
as a byproduct, oxidative particles, which are like soot from a fire. It's like when you burn fire, you make soot, and that soot is just crap, and it clogs up the cell. If you have too many oxidative reactions going on, the cell gets fucked up and falls apart and dies eventually. So antioxidants are substances that you find in foods that mop up that soot, that counteract that reaction. Essentially, it's like those little molecules, like our oxidants are molecules that are missing an electron, which is a little negatively charged particle. So they nick electrons from nearby things. So it's like they're pulling bricks out of all the walls nearby them until the walls fall down. So what antioxidants are is they're substances with a spare electron that give one to those, so they stabilize other molecules, so they slow down those reactions. Yeah. So polyphenols in cacao are particularly good antioxidants, but they also have specific pharmacological properties. Like, you can't just, like, because carrots are antioxidant, blueberries are antioxidant, cherries are antioxidant, green leafies are antioxidant, you know, loads of different molecules and different plants are antioxidant, but they all have different functions because they're all different compounds. They have different shapes and they do different things. And the antioxidants in cacao, some of their properties, they've got some really, so one of their main properties is they stabilize or reduce inflammation in the linings of blood vessels. So they dilate blood vessels, so they improve circulation. And they've actually done CAT scans of people's brains within 20 minutes to half an hour of eating dark chocolate, and it improves the blood flow to the brain by about 20%. And the same to the skin. And actually, I QED'd this by accident one day, because I'd had like this little lump on my arm, which I removed myself with cider vinegar or whatever, because it took so fucking long to get an appointment. I was just like, I'm just going to get rid of it. So by the time I went in for the appointment, excuse my friend, sorry swearing, I went in for the appointment and they biopsied it, thank you. They biopsied it, and, you know, where they take a little lump out of your arm to test it. And so they take them and they put a little styptic thing to stop it bleeding, and you go home. And I went home and had my usual, like, thrice weekly half pint of cacao when I got home. After about 20 minutes, I think I was just watching a film, it was a day off or something, I just felt liquid running down my arm, and I just looked down, and just blood pouring down my arm. So, because obviously I just had minor surgery, and they put something on to, like, constrict all the blood vessels, and I've just drunk what is basically a half pint of a vasodilator that dilates all the blood vessels everywhere. So it's like, note to self, do not drink cacao immediately after having any kind of surgery. Do you know what I mean? So it's important because it dilates everything and it improves the blood flow. So I was running around the thing, like, looking for the first aid kit, going, you idiot. Anyway, so
it's that quick and that.
Well, within 20, but that's what's crazy about it. Like on the CAT scans, it was within 20 minutes to half an hour of a single dose, it improved the blood flow to the brain and to the skin and everywhere else. So that's a really important property. And reducing inflammation in the lining of blood vessels. And there's clinical trials, which I won't get into so much in this, but I think are really important to mention, which show that it reduces the risk of type 2 diabetes. And this is even eating chocolate, like even just crappy eating chocolate with loads of sugar added to it. If it can do that in that, then, you know, the whole bean is way better, because it's these that are doing it, you know. And it also reduces the risk of heart disease and stroke. And I do mention that a bit later, because there's some really interesting stats on that. So it's basically reducing inflammation in the circulatory system and improving circulation everywhere. Roasting or toasting the beans does reduce the level of polyphenols because it breaks them down, which makes the beans taste less sour, but it also produces some other little trace compounds. Some of these guys, what I call the fairy dust compounds, which I'll talk about in a minute, which I think are also important. But it's a compromise. So if you roast them like industrially, like they do at a uniform temperature in big ovens to make a uniform chocolate flavour, they tend to use a slightly higher temperature and a longer roasting time, which destroys more of the polyphenols. The traditional method of toasting them on a kamal, on an open clay dish, you're usually only toasting them for, say, 20 minutes or so, and you're going to get a lot more variation. So the beverages, you've got some that are really well toasted and some that are just slightly toasted. So you get a much more complex flavour and a lot more variation in the compounds in the beverage, so it produces a better quality drink. Xanthines, these are what I call the, you know, like Diana Ross and the two supremes, basically. You've got caffeine, theobromine and theophylline, and caffeine's the Diana Ross of the group, and then you've got theobromine and theophylline. So cacao does contain caffeine, not as much as coffee or tea. It contains far more theobromine that you also find in coffee or tea. Basically, they're all stimulants, but caffeine has a stronger stimulant effect on the brain, but theobromine has a stronger effect on the heart and on the kidneys. So it makes you pee more and it makes your heart beat harder. But there is, particularly when you get to the doses of traditional cacao, where in a dose of traditional cacao you might be having between 20 to 40 grams, you're getting a reasonable dose of caffeine from that. So caffeine is like the motor, the main stimulant, if you like, in cacao. But it's the other stuff around it that changes the effect of it, I think. But that's, the thing about people forget about caffeine is it's kind of like we've only had tea and coffee and cacao for like 500 years. And we're kind of saturated with them now. We live in a culture where we're saturated with stimulants. Like, it's really rare that any one of us doesn't have either caffeine or alcohol or nicotine in our bloodstream at any one time. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, and it's like, if you think about those substances, they are profound shamanic substances. They're profound plant chemicals that will change the culture that they're introduced to. And I often think about coffee, and again, this isn't my thought. I'd recommend you read a book by Dale Pendell called Pharmacology, a series of 3 books actually that are freaking amazing, where he talks about different plant psychotropics and psychoactive compounds from a sort of shamanic perspective. And he talks about how, for example, coffee is the plant of capitalism. Like, coffee came into its own because it's like it's a substance which doesn't alter consciousness in any way that takes you outside the box. It narrows your focus and it makes you work harder. And if you want to regiment the population into sort of like grind out a 24-hour working day, doesn't matter what time of year it is, doesn't matter how old you are, it's the drug that fits that narrative. And I'm not saying coffee's bad. Coffee is what it is. It's an awesome substance. It's just a plant that has its own properties, but it fits that very do your work thing. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's anyway. I know I'm preaching to the gallery here, but yeah. And the drugs that become taboo are the ones which potentially their personalities undermine the narrative.
Yeah,
they're wider.
Sure.
Yeah, of course. So much like any of the psychedelics, or because what they do is in different ways they dissolve boundaries, or they cause changes. The interaction that you might have with that substance will cause you to start questioning things a bit more, perhaps, or whatever. They're potentially problematic. Then
what was the name of that book and that author?
Dale Pendell. Yeah, Pendell. Yeah, he's amazing. The 3 books, they're amazing. They're really fun. Anyway, right, and then the last set of substances, this is a whole different raft of substances. It's what I call the fairy dust substances. I call them that because they're found in really small amounts, and on their own they don't do very much, but when they're combined with all the other stuff in the bean, they add up to interesting effects. So we've got like serotonin, dopamine, phenethylamine, which is like the love chemical, and individually the amount of phenethylamine in cacao is super small, and people have said, there's not enough there to do anything. When you combine it with other substances that are called monoamine oxidase inhibitors, they stop the breakdown of phenethylamine. Turns out that a lot of the polyphenols and some of the other little trace substances in cacao are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So they will stop the breakdown of phenethylamine, they'll stop the breakdown of serotonin, and they'll raise the levels of those things in the brain. So there's some more. Anyway, the point is those. And there's also like trace cannabinoids in cacao. There's anandamide, which is the brain's natural cannabinoid. And again, it's such a small amount that can't possibly do anything. But there are 2 other substances along with the anandamide called, linaloyl ethanolamine and N-linaloyl ethanolamine, and they don't blame me, I didn't name it, but that linaloyl ethanolamine. But what they do is they found that in the gut they stop other enzymes breaking down the anandamide. So you've got these tiny amounts. I think what all these things do is they add up to just lubricating the brain's pleasure circuitry. They're not enough to kind of like make you completely off your nut, but they're enough to just grease the wheels of the and you'll see this from me. Yes, yeah, just like open you up a little bit, subtly shift the perspective, which I'll come on to in a minute. But there's loads of other things. So I've got a picture with the mushrooms here. So the mushrooms. So what you see here is a little picture. This is for a Mexica picture from one of their codices of like 2 of the warriors, because they say only the warriors were allowed to drink cacahuatl. Actually, this might be Mixtec, because the Mixtec, who they lived very close to the Aztecs or the Mexica, and they drank out of these very distinctive 3-legged cups. But you see that foam? That's like the foaming cacahuatl that they're sharing at a feast. And that's the date, by the way. That'll be whatever that is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 13 serpent or whatever. That's the date. And there's obviously a celebration of having the date. What we know is they drank cacahuatl, these foaming cacao preparations, the mexica and the mixtec and the late, by the time of the Spanish conquest. They tended to drink it at all important functions like weddings, funerals, celebrations, but also any big feasts. And they'd end the feast. They'd usually start the feast with tubes of smoking tobacco, and then they'd have the feast, and then they'd end the feast with cacao being handed out. And usually at the end of the feast, they would also ingest mushrooms, psilocybe mushrooms, which they called teonanacatl, which means god flesh. So that the purpose of ingesting the mushrooms would be for divination. What's really interesting is because cacao contains these weak but still noticeably there monoamine oxidase inhibitors, they will potentiate the psilocybin a little bit. They activate it, and we know that it increases the blood flow to the brain. So cacao is a potentiator of mushrooms, and if you've ever had mushrooms and then had cacao, you will notice, or I hope, that usually after, if you have some cacao, if you have mushrooms first and then have cacao like a bit later, it takes you up a level. Yes. So FYI, because that FYI.
Be careful.
Yeah. Well, it's actually an interesting thing because cacao seems to have this effect of accentuating the positive. It's one of the nicest ways of doing it because it's going to flip you towards more having a positive rather than a negative experience. Do you know what I mean? If you're going to strengthen it, you want it to also, you want to be guided towards don't have a bad trip. Do you know what I mean? So, but I think there was a reason. I think there was a reason for why these two things were combined, pharmacologically as well as ritually. I'll go on to the ritual thing in a minute because there were. So in terms of, this is just benefits from the research, from actual science with all the trials and everything, of dark chocolate. So this isn't even just cacao, this is just the dark chocolate. It's ordinary eating chocolate. So regular consumption of moderate amounts of dark chocolate, that'd be something like, in most of the trials, it's like 15 grams 2 or 3 times a week. Reduced risk of heart attack and stroke. Improved circulation, including to the skin. And that really is... there's a thing in my book where I talk about for smokers, how it's really useful for smokers, because obviously smoking fucks up the circulation of the skin, increases your risk of cancer, increases your risk of stroke and heart disease. So I know you've just gone outside for a while, sorry. But
It's true.
The point there is that cacao is a really good thing to have if you are a smoker, because we know it reduces the risk of certain cells turning cancerous, it reduces the risk of heart attack, stroke, and improves the circulation to the skin. So it's kind of like it helps. The other thing is though that with nicotine, if you smoke, it speeds up the metabolism. It speeds up the metabolism of caffeine. So you get improved blood sugar, which talked about, improved mood, which we all know about. That's why many people eat chocolate. The mood thing is interesting though, because when they gave people dark chocolate to eat, they found that the mood was intention dependent. So in other words, if people just ate it, not mindfully or whatever, they didn't really notice much.
Yeah.
But when they gave them cacao to eat, or just chocolate, not even drinking cacao, just ordinary dark chocolate to eat, and said focus on it, their mood improved. And they compared that with like apples, crackers and water, no difference, mindfully or not, no difference. With cacao, big difference, but only when it was activated with intention. Wow. So that's the big thing. That's actually just a couple of little bits of research, very small groups, but just comparing eating chocolate to other foods, and the intention was key. So, and then possible reduced risk of some cancers, especially lung cancer, because we know in the laboratory it reduces the growth of cancer cells. And there seems to be some epidemiological link, but we don't know, that's only possible. And then possible prevention of age-related brain disorders such as Alzheimer's, maybe Parkinson's disease. That's again just from a few small bits of clinical research and some early research showing some benefit possibly, but we don't know. But I think for vascular dementia, for one of the kinds of dementia which is linked to crappy blood flow to the brain, which is really common, because people think of dementia and they just think, oh, Alzheimer's, but actually there's loads of different types. There's like Parkinson's related, there's Alzheimer's, there's Lewy body dementia, which is another one, and there's vascular dementia, which is when the circulation's all clogged up. So the circulation of the brain's fucked. So I reckon cacao would be really good for that. Okay. all right, this is something that made me excited. I'm getting onto the magic bit. All of this is building up to the magic bit, I promise you folks, because it's all relevant. This is all the like...
All interested.
Okay, thank you. Well, this I thought was interesting because it's comparing the data from lots of different epidemiological surveys of the population on what effects social isolation has on the risk of death. So being socially isolated increases your risk of death by 29%.
Yeah.
Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Social distancing. Anyway, whatever. So there's that. It increases your risk of stroke by 32%, death by stroke, and increases your risk of death by heart attack by 29%. Now, what I found that was really interesting is just eating ordinary dark chocolate, just 7.5 grams a day, more than five times a week or more, reduced the risk of stroke by 29%, almost as much as social isolation increases it. Chocolate, and that's just any kind of freaking chocolate, 5 times a week or more. There's no grams per day in this survey, which is really bad, but I assume they mean dark chocolate here, and I would guess something around 10 to 15 grams, otherwise it's not going to be enough. But I read the whole paper, it wasn't just the abstract, the whole paper, they didn't even name the amount of chocolate. I'm just like, anyway, whatever. Important details aside, they found that the people who ate chocolate more regularly, the highest percentile of chocolate consumers, it reduced their risk of death from coronary heart disease by 47%. And these are surveys, by the way, using thousands of people. They're not like 400 people, they're not like 40 people, they're population surveys, so they're significant. And then dietary cacao, this is from the same survey as the other one, 7.5 grams a day, 5 times a week or more, reduced the risk of death from cardiovascular disease by 37%. So what's in theory, just cacao offsets the increased risk of death, particularly increased risk of death through heart disease and stroke, induced by social isolation. I think that's really, really interesting, given some of the stuff I'm going to talk about with the mythology and whatever. But anyway, so my 2 little pet theories about what cacao does pharmacologically. One, I describe it as a hedonic modifier, which is just my fancy name for that pleasure lubrication thing in the brain. It modifies, hedonic means pleasure sensitivity. So hedonic modifier, it modifies your sensitivity to pleasure. And that was from that trial I said about the intention. Like when people intentionally ate it, their mood improved. When they didn't eat it with intention, their mood just didn't change. So in experimental, that was the intention-dependent effects on mood, where mindful consumption improved mood, whereas non-mindful didn't. And then they also found that with chronic consumption or regular consumption of cacao, the level of serotonin in the brain of volunteers this is in rats. They found that the level of serotonin in rat brains increased, and in humans, this is a little bit of a random one, but the level of this because obviously they can't, because it's considered ethically okay to experiment on rats and then murder them and siphon the stuff out, the juice out of their brains to see how much serotonin was in there. You can't do that with humans because it's considered for some reason a bit unethical. So what they did was they got these volunteers who obviously they paid and everything, and they drew out their spinal cord, the cerebrospinal fluid. I know, but they were paid. Money makes everything okay. So they drew it out of the spine and they found the level of 5-HIAA, which is this breakdown product of serotonin. So it's like this metabolite, this byproduct of serotonin. And in those who had been having cacao for at least 2 weeks daily, it was much higher. What was interesting is in a separate study, they also found that cacao, I'm going to go on to it in the next slide actually, but cacao also both acutely with single doses and over 2 weeks lowered the level of cortisol or stress steroid and adrenaline measurable in saliva and in urine. That's both with immediate dosing and with regular dosing over a couple of weeks. So it lowered the measurable levels of stress in people and it increased the level of this serotonin byproduct in the spinal cord. What we found from a separate survey is that war veterans who are at much increased risk of suicide, particularly those who did commit suicide on autopsy, in their spinal column, they were found to have lower levels of 5-HIAA, so lower serotonin turnover, and much higher levels of cortisol. So I think cacao is like potentially anti-suicide. You know what I mean? It's like it's really interesting when you sort of get into the nitty-gritty of all this gubbins. But so the other hypothesis I have pharmacologically is that 1, hedonic modifier, 2, again my phrase, this has less support, I'd say, anti-phobic or against fear. This is really based on this one little experiment in rats where they tested what's called conditioned fear, which is learned fear responses, where you put the little rats in a maze. It's actually not really a maze, it's just like a corridor which is covered, and then you've got an open bit so they can run out into the open and explore, or they can run into the covered bit and hide. So they poke them out of the tunnel and then see what they do. And obviously the first thing they all do is they crouch because they're like suddenly out in the open. And then the ones that are a little bit braver will go and explore the open bit, and the ones that are a little bit more freaked out will go and hide in the tunnel. And they found that the rats who'd been dosed up with cacao, acutely given a single large dose of cacao, lower than the dose you'd taken a ceremonial dose, had less conditioned fear. They would explore more. Now, what's interesting about this, and what's really key for me about this, is that caffeine does the opposite. So the whole thing about, oh, this could just be a caffeine effect. No, this is specific to cacao, the whole plant. If you give caffeine, it actually either does nothing for conditioned fear or increases it because it increases anxiety.
Yeah.
And amphetamine also increases anxiety. Amphetamine is just a general magnifier. It will magnify positive and it will magnify negative. It will magnify happy thoughts and it will magnify aggression. Do you know what I mean? Whereas in cacao and these experiments did that. So that's just one little rat experiment, but I thought that was so key because it clearly showed a difference. And then there's the stress modulation that I talked about, which is lowering cortisol and adrenaline in human volunteers with single doses and over a couple of weeks. And again, that was just using ordinary dark chocolate, quite a lot, 50 grams a day of 72%, but that's just ordinary crappy cacao, eating
cacao.
So the other thing they found in that experiment was after a couple of weeks, it changed the volunteers' microbiome. It changed their gut flora, so they had more of the good gut flora, like the lactobacilli and the acidophilus.
Taking the cacao?
Yes. So it's the polyphenols, again, were inhibiting the growth of naughty microbes and changing the population. And what we now know is that our gut and our brain are constantly talking to each other. There are more cells of microbes in our bodies than there are human cells. We're actually freaking coral reefs. And the whole idea that we are individuals is kind of a product of our conscious mind inventing shit, we're actually composites of lots of little different things collaborating physically and I suspect mentally as well. So the point is, if cacao actually modifies, it doesn't just modify the brain on an observable thinky level here and the hormones in terms of the cortisol, it actually modifies the gut flora as well in a beneficial way. This isn't to say that there may be a downside to it. In one experiment, they found that cacao, it reduced food sensitivities in these rats that they fed cacao for a couple of weeks. But it also, in those rats which they'd given foods which were allergenic, which caused inflammation, they had a slightly thinner gut lining. I think that's really interesting. So I think what cacao probably does is it helps the gut flora. It reduces your stress levels. The fact that it maybe slightly thins the gut lining and makes it more permeable is really interesting, because one of my hypotheses, as I'm about to go on to in the mythology bit, is that it's a portal opener. It helps you connect with other levels, which is why they used it with mushrooms and why they used it in ceremony. Do you see where I'm going with this? It's all building. Promise you. It sort of adds up. So, right. Stella Cacao. So this is the sort of star lore of it. So this is me 10 years ago with this curandero. He's Curandero Diego and he's the man. When I went there, he's got like 40 patients sitting in his yard waiting to see him, and he just treats people all the time. And I went there to talk to him because he's got a little cacao tree in his yard, and I wanted to find out how he used cacao. And my hypothesis was, if I was to fit cacao into European astrology, obviously the Maya used a whole different system and a whole different mythology, I would think of cacao as a plant of Venus, in our money, if you like, because Venus is pleasure, Venus is joy, Venus is connection, Venus is expelling inflammation and getting rid of pain. And there were lots of other little things in the traditional use. It was used as a galactagogue to improve breast milk production, for example, which is all very Venus stuff. So I said, what do you use it for? And he said, I use the flowers. And I said, do you use it, for example, the whole tree, to treat problems with the throat and the urinary tract? And he was like, yeah. So he uses infusion of the flowers to treat UTIs. And he said, oh, you're a curandero like me. And I was like, that's really interesting because of like those. The reason I said those was that the throat and the urinary tract in Western astrology were ruled by Venus, but obviously this Diego is operating in the 21st century after 500 years of colonialization. So has the way he uses the plants being influenced by the European beliefs? You know what I mean?
Catholicized.
Yeah. So that's what's so interesting about Mexico. It's like Catholicism, but kind of not. It's like pagan Catholicism.
Yeah,
it's a bit like, you know, Haiti,
Like North Wales.
Yes, yeah, where the saints are kind of like dress up for the old gods. Do you know what I mean? That's like, if you just dig a little bit, they're sort of like not what you think they are.
Yeah.
And in all these stalls, they're selling like candles with the Virgin Mary on them to attract luck and like whatever to attract money. And like literally the same stalls where they're selling candles and magical unguents to like dispel luck and whatever. They've got leaflets saying, "Beware of these demonic influences." It's just like it's sort of like two cultures like that. It's really interesting.
I love Mexico.
Yeah, it's crazy culture. Yeah, it's just an amazing country, part of the world. I love it. Anyway, right, this is Senora Cal, who was a midwife, a comadrona in Guatemala, and she's showing me she was attempting to show me how they separate cocoa butter by hand, but it was a day a bit like today, where for them it was freezing. For me, it was like, this is just pleasantly normal, but for them it was like a really cold day. And she couldn't get it to do it, and she was like, won't work. And I was like, it's just because it needs to be hot, I think, for the cocoa butter to melt and to separate. But she showed me this other method as well, but she was brilliant. She told me that they use cacao a lot because she's a midwife. She said we recommend it to breastfeeding women to improve their milk supply, and I reckon it be, just thinking about it practically, both maize and cacao are foods that will store dry. So if there's a famine or something on, they're a good source of nutrients that you can store.
For the cows as well.
What, the cows? What do you mean?
Well, no. For your animals as well as you.
Oh, maybe the maize. Yes, sorry. So cacao would be something that's storable. So the point about this is that these were sort of like Venus connections in old European money. Okay, so this. And Anita was the one who sort of mentioned Ixchel, the Mayan goddess of fertility. And this is Chak, who is a Mayan rain god. And this is an old mural. I think it might be from, yes, it is beautiful, isn't it? And it shows them, they're exchanging gifts of cacao and drinking. This is a big urn of foamy cacao down there. And this is a little contract between them. And these two were the two gods of fertility in the wider sense. Because Ixchel is obviously fertility in the personal sense, like pregnancy and birth. And Chak is the god of rain and agriculture. So they're here exchanging cacao, exchanging gifts.
So what was she against?
Ixchel. She's also the goddess of healing, one of the Maya goddesses of healing. There's a really good book called Sastun, written by Rosita Arvigo.
So this is almost nature meeting human.
Something like that. I mean, it's just the point here I was really making is that there's an association between cacao and fertility, both in terms of its uses and in terms of the deities it was associated with. We don't know a lot about the details of the Mayan myths because a lot of them were lost, unfortunately. So, but anyway, I thought that was a really interesting picture. And okay, so Theobroma as Venus in European money, in Old World money. This is just me trying to parcel it in the system that I use when I'm thinking about astrology. In traditional mythology, it was linked to morning star deities, both Mexica deities like Quetzalcoatl, the god of knowledge, who in the Mexica god of knowledge, he was like a really benign god. He was one of the only Mexica gods who didn't require human sacrifice. Wow. All the other gods were kind of big on it. He was like, no, I don't want that. And one of the myths, Quetzalcoatl, because there are various ones, were that one of the origin myths was that he was once a king in the human world. And because he was also a god, he stole cacao from the gods to give to the people to make them happy. And when the gods found out, they sent his little nemesis, which is like his dark brother, like the Darth Vader version of him, down to Earth. and that dark nemesis is called Tezcatlipoca, or smoking mirror, and Tezcatlipoca came in the guise of a wise person, and saying, and Tezcatlipoca, or smoking mirror, brought to the court, he said, oh, you're giving everyone cacao, but I can bring you the drink of absolute happiness and wisdom, which was pulque, or fermented, like Mexican beer, basically, made from fermented maguey cactus sap. So he gave it to King Quetzalcoatl to drink, and Quetzalcoatl got drunk, which in Mesoamerica was a huge taboo. Like, old people were allowed to be drunk publicly, but if anyone else was drunk publicly, it was a massive sin and a crime. So he got drunk and acted the fool and made a disgrace of himself, and then so he had to go into exile. And as he went into exile, he saw that all the cacao trees he planted had been turned into maguey, like spiny cactuses, which they made pulque out of, etc. And then when he got to the coast, he planted a cacao tree and went into the west, into the sea. This is really interesting because Quetzalcoatl has been identified with the evening star. That's Venus as an evening star. She's only visible in the west after the sun has set. And on the west coast in Tabasco is one of the cacao growing regions. It's one of the only cacao growing regions in that part of the world. So obviously the arid mainland, only the cactus will grow, cacao won't grow there. So that's one of the little origin myths. So there's one of the Mayan deities, Ekchuar, who's a scorpion-tailed deity we know is linked to cacao because he was a merchant god, and he's often depicted with packs of cacao beans on his back. And he was an underworld god. We don't know a lot about him, just he was an old geezer who carried cacao on his back and had his name means black scorpion, and he was associated with the evening star Venus as well. So traditional association with intoxication, cacao in the literature in Aztec poems is described as being under the influence of cacao, is described as being intoxicated, but they use that word a lot. They use it for like poetry, and for art and for song. Anything that changes your state was intoxication. Ritual use for attracting good, that's in curanderismo in modern Mexico. Cacao beans used in rituals for bringing good forces. Traditional medicinal uses, it was cooling, fattening for helping weight gain after illness or whatever. Galactagogue to help breast milk production, and anti-venom, it was used to prevent harm from snake bites, which is interesting because of the circulatory properties. Some snake venoms cause coagulation and inflammation in blood vessels. And then it benefits health and is pleasant tasting and is associated with luxury, wealth and high status in Mesoamerica and still today. If you think about all the adverts for chocolate you've ever seen, do you know what I mean? Yeah. Like, it's got that thing where it's always sold as luxury thing. That has ancient, like, that goes way back. Okay. All right, that's Quetzalcoatl, who I was talking about. That's one of the Mexica drawings of him, late post-classic Mexica god of knowledge and culture. He was the one who ended up getting usurped when he got drunk. This is a drawing. This is a lovely mural. I don't know if you can see it from a late classic Maya site called Caxtla. And there's this blue Venus god here. We know it's the Venus god because that little skirt he's wearing with the eye in the middle and those rays coming off it, that's like how they depicted stars and specifically how Venus was shown. And he's got a scorpion tail. Can you see there? Yeah. And then on either side of him, sorry Lou. I'm coming. All right. On either side of him, there's two little animals. There's a toad, and I think, is that a turtle? It's supposed to be a turtle, but there's a jaguar's head on it. And then on this side, there is a cacao tree, and on this side, there's a maize plant. Wow. Now, this little bit, this strip at the bottom with the water, that's sometimes described as a sky band, and it's their sort of zodiac band, but it also shows the underworld, because for the Maya and the Mexica, the underworld was a wet, watery place. Because when you dig down, there's water under the earth, and there's a lot of sinkholes in the Yucatan Peninsula. Cenotes, yeah, exactly. So you go down, there's fresh water, and then on top of salt water. So the underworld was watery. These, we think... No, that wasn't a bad thing at all. That wasn't a bad thing. So we think these are constellations, the turtle and the frog, when Maya names for different constellations. And I wonder about the maize is likely to be the sun, because we know the maize gods were always associated with the sun. Maize is yellow, it lives for 1 year and then dies back, has to be replanted. It grows upwards, it needs heat, and it's their basic food. It's like bread in Europe or whatever. So maize in all their myths was associated with the sun god, and in a lot of their myths, the sun god has to die, go down to the underworld, and be reborn. And in some of those myths, and I'll tell you about one of them in a minute, that what the maize sun god encounters in the underworld is cacao in one form or another. So cacao is like the underworld version of the maize sun god. And if you think about the two plants, maize grows and dies in a year. Cacao lives for many years. Cacao needs shade, maize needs sun. Cacao pods grow down, maize grows up. Wow. Maize, you've got the cobs that are out in the middle. Cacao has the shell and then the lining and then the cobs growing down in the middle, with all the seeds on the side. So there's these weird little parallels. And in terms of harvesting, when the maize is ready to harvest, the cacao is ready to plant. There's this overlap in terms of the calendar as well. So they lend themselves to like symbolic juxtaposition. And obviously they're combined in foods. And in one of the myths, like one of the gods who created humanity used his own blood and maize and cacao to make the dough that made the first humans. Wow. So it's kind of groovy.
Oh, I love Momo.
Oh, so good. So, all right, so we're moving. So that was a little bit of random star lore thrown in, linking cacao to Venus in the old world as well. The fourth part of the talk I did that started off with a little bit of beverages, then I went into a bit of the sciencey stuff, and then I talked about a bit of the star lore of it, and then I'm just going to talk a bit more about the myths, the mythology, which I'd already started getting into. So a little bit of a diversion, and then we'll come back around. So most of you will probably know, like in the old world, there's this idea of the axis mundi, the tree that connects the realms, which in Norse mythology was Yggdrasil, right? Which has its roots in the underworld. We live in the middle world, and then its branches are in the heavens, right? Mm-hmm. This myth is part of what's sometimes called the perennial philosophy. It's found in cultures all around the world. This idea of sort of living conduit tree symbolizes a tree that connects the realms, and we're in the middle. So in the new world, the tree was in the old world. You probably know that the Norse visualized it as an ash tree. It was a tree that goes straight up, it's fast growing, whatever. In the old world, it was visualized as a saber tree mostly, which is a very tall tree in the old world. And they're thought to be 13 levels of the celestial world or heaven and 9 levels of the underworld in their specific version. Okay, so this is a Mayan depiction of the world tree, and it's showing the connection to the star lore, because the world tree, their name, one of the Mayan names for the world tree was Wakachan, which is also their name for the Milky Way, which they saw as the path between the realm of the gods and the realm of the humans. So the Milky Way was the world tree in the sky. And that they always depict the world tree as a very stylized tree with its roots down here in the underworld, and then you've got a little bird. This is a bird with its plumed tail and a little beak there. It's a quetzal bird, which is native to Mesoamerica, sitting on top, and that bird was Itzam-Ye, which was one of their creation myths. He was like punished for hubris. He tried to be the sun before the sun was created, and the creator god like had him shot out of the tree and whatever. But Itzam-Ye is also the constellation of, I think, the Big Dipper, because as the year changes, the Milky Way, the orientation of the Milky Way falls towards the horizon. So the bird, the Big Dipper, falls off the top of the tree, and the god who had him shot down, one of his name, the creator god's name was Hurricane. And when Itzam-Ye falls towards the horizon, it signals the start of the hurricane season. So as usual, the mythology connects to the real world events. And then this snake going through the branches of the tree, think about that. Old world mythology, Genesis, interesting connections maybe. The snake was the ecliptic, which is the path of the apparent path of the sun around the earth, that what we call the zodiac. So which is obviously massively important in all forms of astrology and divination worldwide. So the tree itself is the Milky Way, and then the ecliptic sort of runs parallel to it or cuts across it. And that was the snake in the branches of the tree. This is the interesting thing here is that while saber in most of the texts and myths is their earthly depiction of the world tree, the world tree is sometimes depicted as cacao, as you will see here.
So this is a late Mexica drawing of the world tree. And we can tell it's the world tree because you can see it's Samier, the bird, sitting at the top of the tree there. The roots in the underworld, you can see it's emerging from this guy with a skeleton headdress and little clawed hands and feet there. And we know it's a cacao tree because you can see these little rugby balls growing off the ends of the branches there and at the bottom, which are little cacao pods. And cacao pods grow off the branches. They don't grow at the ends of the branches, they grow off the trunk of the tree. It's called cauliflory, it's detached. So what's interesting about this is we've got this is a slightly gory and explicit picture rather. We've got these two guys performing auto-sacrifice, where they're letting blood from their penises, which are enlarged for pictorial purposes. They're letting blood, and there's this guy down here who's possibly being sacrificed, maybe a god of death, and there's a literal portal, like a 1950s comic portal, opening up behind the tree.
Cenote.
It's cenote was a portal. Yeah. It was a literal portal. But the reason for this sacred sites in Mesoamerica, like cenotes, like mountains, were that they were what in old Celtic Europe would have been called thin places where the realms were connected to each other. So they were sacred because they were openings into the underworld, or they connected this world to the heavens. Like a mountain, right? You go to the top of the mountain, you're nearer the heavens, whatever. And if it's a mountain with a spring coming out of it, that's like the underworld emerging, and it's going towards the heavens. So it's connecting the levels. So that's why they sometimes built shrines and temples there. All their shrines and temples were designed to replicate those places. The stepped mountains, the ziggurats, which were often hollow inside, or the ball courts, which were like cenotes, they were sort of stepped downwards. The ball courts, if you look at Mesoamerican ball courts where the sacred ball game was played, they were like stepped like the jaws of serpents. And cenotes were sometimes regarded as serpent mouths into the earth, because the serpent in Mesoamerican mythology was a sort of a symbolic connector of life and death, presumably because snakes are kind of scary and dangerous and kind of uncanny because they shed their skins and unhinge their jaws, but they're also very highly poisonous. In particularly a lot of the snakes in Central America, you get bit, you're dead. So they're uncanny, they're conduits between life and death. So in rituals, what they were trying to do, and we know this because this is still done in a lot of traditional rituals, was to open the portal so you can connect with the ancestors and connect with the gods. And in many of these rituals were designed to summon what was literally called a vision serpent, which was really, I think of it a bit like snakes and ladders serpent, where you could go down or up. You go through the jaw of the serpent. It's a scary experience. Part of you feels like it's dying. We all know that if you've taken psychoactives, really strong psychedelics, they're ego dissolving, right? They're a little bit scary. So it's kind of like you're going through the serpent's jaws and up or down or whatever. Yeah. So, but the idea with auto-sacrifice or any kind of sacrifice is that you're giving some energy. And in Mesoamerican mythology, as with many peoples worldwide, it was thought that your living blood carried the energy or essence of your ancestors. So by giving some of that energy, you were empowering the ritual, and you were sort of providing a physical essence of the ancestors for it. So it's kind of what's the reason cacao may have been involved in these myths is partly because of some of the pharmacology I've talked about, where it potentiates mushrooms, it facilitates pleasure, it reduces conditioned fear a little bit. It perfectly, on a physical level, prepares you for ritual, I think, in that way. It just makes your boundaries a little bit thinner, I think, and also makes you more open to stuff. Just a little bit. It just physically opens you up slightly. And protective, yeah, exactly, perfect. Yeah, because it was like protective against snake venom. Drinking cacao, that was thought would protect you. If you're bitten by a snake, you were less likely to die. And I think that while I wouldn't rely on that as an anti-venom if you were travelling in Central America, I think there's probably some truth to it, because as I said, a lot of snake venoms cause your blood to coagulate, a lot of them are neurotoxic. Some of the properties in cacao might...
What's this chap down here?
The chap down here, I think, is a guy, either he's the god of death, Mictlantecuhtli, but the god of death is usually just has a skull head, he doesn't have a human head, or he's a guy who has had his heart cut out. Because they did perform human sacrifice. That was their highest form of sacrifice. That was their highest payment.
to cut the living heart of the particle.
Are these cacao pods here again?
Those are cacao pods there as well. Now that I'm getting onto this, cacao was I'll get there. So anyway, here we've got, and this is a Mayan thing from Bonampak, I think, where you've got this guy on either side with the big headdress sitting down. I think that's the Mayan god Kawil, who's a god of plenty. He's a god of abundance, and he's like one of the ruling gods. And he's got a little chap sitting down there, I think grinding cacao, or is the chap speaking up to him. And then this big tree in the middle, that's a cacao tree with all the pods growing off the trunk. And you've got this head. Can you see the little head coming out of the tree in the middle? Cacao trees are often depicted in Mesoamerican art with ancestors emerging from them, or with with some kind of person coming out of them. And on either side, Chichen Itza, one of the Mayan sites, the late classic Mayan sites, you've got the doorway of the Temple of the Owls, which is the Temple of the Dead. And either side of the doorway, you've got two carved cacao trees, which have little discs carved all over them. Discs was the Mayan symbol for jade, which means very precious. Like jade was their most precious thing. So like two cacao trees on either side of the Temple of the Owls, so-called, which is something to do with the ancestors. And the base of the bottom of these trees, you have carvings of ancestors emerging with like speech scrolls coming out of their mouth, like they're speaking. And you see this in a lot of the pottery things. Like you can see there's a little breath of something coming out of his mouth there. The ancestors speaking through the tree. My feeling is cacao, and one of the Mexica, or later Aztec names for cacao was Yolol Estli, which means the heart, the blood. Think about what I was saying about the pharmacology earlier, about how we've now found that cacao reduces the risk of heart attack and stroke and dilates blood vessels, whatever. You could think, oh, it's just that. But they didn't know about that physical stuff. They were looking at cacao, I think, as a repository of life force. And if the ancestors lived in the blood, there's something about cacao that was connecting you to the ancestors. It was a repository of life force in the same way that the blood was, particularly the blood from human hearts. And there is a really famous Mayan myth cycle by the Quiche, which is called the hero twin cycle. And it's actually a sort of analogy of the death of the sun god when he goes down into the underworld and gets killed and whatever. Basically, these two twins that are born, and they're playing a ball game one day, and they're banging the ball up and down, annoys the gods of death who are underneath in the basement. So the gods of death send a messenger to summon them to say hello or whatever. So they come downstairs, say hello to the gods of death, and they both get killed, and the gods of death bury them in the underworld. So that's done with. But then before they left, one of them's had kids who also happen to be twins, and those twins grow up. And one day they find their father and their uncle's ball game equipment, and they start playing ball game. And the gods of death get really annoyed by the banging again, so they summon them, and there's this really elaborate way that they summon them. Like they send a beetle that gets swallowed by a bird, that gets swallowed by a bigger bird, that gets swallowed by a and then eventually when they shoot this bird, and then when they shoot the bird and it drops down, it sort of regurgitates a toad, which regurgitates a beetle, which eventually gives it's really bizarre. There's clearly some symbolism about shamanic transformation and about how messages come to you from the underworld or whatever. But anyway, so they get a message to come down to the underworld, and their grandmother, who of course is the dead guy's mother, says, don't go, they'll kill you, it's a trick, yada yada. So they say, don't worry, we'll be fine. And they plant maize in the garden and say, as long as this maize is alive, we're okay. If the maize dies, we're dead. So she goes, okay. So then they go to the underworld, and the gods of death do try to trick them. They put them through loads and loads of trials. And at one point, one of them gets decapitated, and they use his head as the ball in the ball game. And then this rabbit comes and helps them by pretending to be the ball, and they stick his head back on. And then eventually it's
Where did they get it?
Well, every little bit of symbolism in this makes sense if you tie it back into the Star Lord. This is what's so crazy about it. The Maya saw a rabbit in the face of the moon.
Yeah.
So the decapitation, think about eclipses, and the face of the moon being occluded, and then the rabbit takes the place of it. And it's just, there's all these little references that snuck in there. So if you know how to decode it, you can see what they're talking about. But anyway, at the end of the ball game, they win, And the gods of death are like, okay, well, you win. But then this little guy comes in from the sideline and says they're tricking you. They're going to kill you anyway. So they say, okay, after they kill us, what you have to do is tell them that they need to scatter our ashes into the river in the underworld. Oh, I missed out a really important bit of the story. Okay, backtrack slightly. After the first pair of twins, because it's the first pair of twins, you know, their parents who went down to the underworld and got killed. This is the really important bit. When they were buried in the underworld, in the place that they were buried, at a crossroads in the underworld, a tree grew, and it bore fruit. And one of the fruits was the head of one of the guys who was killed. Yeah. And the daughter of the god of the underworld, the king of the underworld, she heard from all the people in the underworld, oh, this tree's fruits are really tasty. So she came to check it out, and the guy's head spat in her palm, and she became pregnant, because that's how that works. And so she was, and interestingly, she was called Blood Moon, which again is another sort of eclipse thing, right? Mm-hmm. So she knowing she's pregnant, and that it's probably linked to these dead guys who weren't supposed to be there, and she wasn't supposed to be going to that tree anyway, she tries to hide it, but her father, the god of the underworld, finds out, and she runs away from the underworld and goes back up and finds the boy's mother, the first set of twins' mother, and begs her to let her in, and she lets her in, and then she has the twins, the young boys, who then later are playing ball and get sent down to the underworld. Get me? At this point, what happens is the younger twins have gone down to the underworld. They've won the ball game, but they know the gods of death are going to trick them. So they tell this little guy who comes and says they're going to kill you in a minute. They say, tell the gods of death to when we die, tell them to burn our bodies and scatter our ashes in the river in the underworld. But don't tell them that we told you to do that. So that's what happens. Basically, the gods of death invite them to a feast. They kill them. So then this guy says, oh, in order to make sure that they're gone forever, you must burn their bodies and scatter their ashes in the river in the underworld. 14 days later or something, they appear in the river as two fish. And then they crawl out of the river and become people. And they go around and visit, like they go around in the underworld miraculously resurrecting people. And the gods of death hear about this. And so what they do is they go around killing people in the underworld and then bringing them back to life. So the gods of death hear about this and invite them to their court and say, do this for us, because they don't realise it's the two guys that they killed earlier come back to life in a different form. And so the two twins kill the gods of death and then don't bring them back to life. And so they take their little revenge. Then they go and visit their father and their tree in the underworld and the place of their father and their uncle's grave. And they can't revive them. They can't revive them because it's been too long and they're too messed up. So they say, what we'll do is we'll revere you in the human world. We'll remember your names and we'll revere you. And then they emerge from the underworld as the sun and the moon. And that's the whole crazy cycle. So the interesting thing is, a lot of people in this myth have said that the tree that in the underworld with the guy's head was a gourd tree. But gourd fruit is pretty much inedible. It's gross, whereas cacao fruit is edible and it's tasty. And there's lots of other evidence to this, because in lots of the pottery depictions and the murals, we see this cacao tree with the head speaking and the ancestors emerging from it. So there's something about cacao that was linked to that sort of underworld. And as I say, it's juxtaposed with maize. Because remember, they planted maize in their grandmother's garden before they went down, and said when the maize dies, it means we're dead. And by the way, when they were killed, the maize dies, and then she's upset, and then 14 days later, when they come back as two fish, the maize grows again. She's like, oh, they're alive. So even the two fish thing is really important. This is the Maya glyph for cacao, which is like a fish.
Oh wow!
And can you see there's two dots in front of its mouth? Yeah. There are little fish bubbles. That literally, the literal name Cacao, the Maya name for fish is Ka. Ka-wa. It means two fish. That is their glyph for cacao. The name means two fish. So the myth of the hero twins, where they are killed, they are burned, their ground bodies are mixed with water and emerge as two fish, making cacao. Yes.
Yes. Pisces is two fish. fish.
Yeah, it's
That's
true.
so cute. I'm a Pisces.
It's true. But anyway, so I think that's really crazy. I can't claim credit for doing that detective work. There's this amazing guy who's done a whole PhD on cacao and the hero twins myth, and he did all this crazy detective work.
Is that the cellular structure? Is what you're saying? What is that?
No, that is the Mayan hieroglyphs. You know, in their writing, that's how they wrote cacao.
Right.
And it was like a pun, I think, because it's like just they'd obviously, we think, or historians think, whatever, that they borrowed the name from an Olmec word, like way back in 800 BC. So the Maya got the word cacao, but because the Mayan word for fish was ka, they thought it was like kakawa. It's two fish. So they wrote cacao as a glyph for a fish with two dots in front of it. So their whole myth was, anyway, you see where I'm going with that? They built the myth around the sort of pun around the word. So that's the hero twins myth. So so it's like, this is my little background of prepared cacao. These are two little separate bits. You can't really see what the hell is going on there, but that is a bit from the Borgia Codex, which is one of the Mexica codices.
It looks like superheroes.
It's crazy, isn't it? Well, what this is, they think this represents the creation of the universe. like the Mexica equivalent of the Big Bang or something.
Wow, it's great.
And you've got a skull-faced vessel with all this brown liquid foaming out the top of it, and all these rays coming out of it, and you see these little serpents coming out of it, which represent wind or air. And you've got this skull-faced being on top, dancing on top of it. I think, when I've read about this, this is clearly a bowl of beer or some foaming liquid. It's obviously cacao. That's obviously chocolate. It's brown. If you look at the fucking myths about the underworld, you've got the underworld god on top of it. You've got the air, the representations of the snakes, which represent wind. And also, in Mesoamerican myth, rainbows were visualized as serpents because they connected sky and earth, like they remember the vision serpent. But the bubbles in cacao, if you prepare it properly, reflect light, because they're oily, they reflect the rainbow. You've got a living rainbow serpent in every bubble. So this is like a bowl of foaming liquid in a bowl shaped like a fucking skull with the death god above it, with all these snakes coming out of it. It's like, anyway, so that's that. I've not got that confirmed, but that is what I think that probably is.
Where did you find that?
That is from the Borgia Codex. I think it's late sort of 15th century before the conquest. Then this is I don't know if it's a curandero or a priest of the Lacandon Maya in modern day Guatemala. And what this is showing is that all these little vessels are what they're called, they're god pots. It's a shrine, basically. And each of those pots is supposed to house a god or a spirit. And in order to draw the spirit into it, they put into each pot 5 cacao beans. And the cacao beans symbolize the vital organs of that being. It symbolizes the heart and the lungs and the diaphragm and something else. So it's this consistent connection with cacao and the ancestors and the gods and vitality and vital force and bringing things to life. Reanimation. That's the idea. And the idea that the essence that's in the blood, the essence of the ancestors, is also present in cacao. Where are we? Okay. So, and then just a few little randoms from first of all, from alchemy. When cacao was brought to Europe, some of the alchemists did little experiments with it. And this one, Henry Stubb, who wrote a whole book on chocolate in the 1600s, he distilled cacao. And he found that the spirits of cacao, which is what we now call an aromatic water, were as red as blood. And the caput mortuum, which is what remains when you burn everything to ash and dissolve the ashes in water, it's the residue that's left. He said they tasted of fat flesh when boiled. So if you did the same thing with meat and then burned all meat to ash and then dissolved the ash in water, chucked away the water, and that remaining insoluble solid, that's called the caput mortuum, or death's head of any substance in alchemy. It's the most gross bit of it when you burn everything else away. As in gross as in heavy, not disgusting, as in just like the red, because you made a face like, what are you talking about? So that residue, he said it tasted the same as the residue of flesh.
From the cacao.
From cacao.
Wow.
And he said the fixed sulfur, which is what we now call the essential oil, was and had an inexpressible aromaticalness on the tongue, seemed to delight and refresh the heart and stomach, but with a great resemblance still of flesh. So when he did this thing of meat, he found that the essence of cacao was red like blood and tasted like the same product of flesh, which I think is, it could write it off as random, but it's so interesting because he didn't know anything about the traditional mythology of it, where it was linked to the blood, the living blood of people. Anyway, so, and then the homeopathic chocolatum, which was a product made just from ordinary chocolate in the 80s, it's a recent homeopathic thing. The provers experienced various different symptoms, but it was linked consistently to feelings of being the outsider, the outcast, to anxiety, to emotional instability, a need to tell the truth and react against deception, physical coldness and palpitations. So I picked up from that the idea of the sort of Quetzalcoatl myth, the exile, being deposed or taken out of your, like, either going into the underworld or being cast out in some way. There's a really strong feeling of people who are drawn to chocolatum, and also the heart stuff, like the palpitations. And then traditional Chinese medicine, chocolate, which they call chakali, which is just like Chinese pronunciation chocolate, chakali, where it tonifies the heart and kidney yang, which in Western money means it regulates the adrenals and energy metabolism and promotes sexual functions and growth and strengthens resistance. So it's the same idea of being a tonic. And then just my summary of some of those, because that was a whole, like, remember there's like 14 years of gubbins in that book. So this is like quite a little, cereal box version of it. But some of the summaries of all those themes, I would say, would be cacao as the world tree, linking the underworld, earth and heaven. Cacao is a tree of the underworld, the maize god's underworld counterpart. And cacao in traditional mythology was said to protect maize in some way, which is really interesting. Like the Maya said, cacao protects maize. It's cacao used in sacrifice, like in the Lacandon Maya's god pots, or in traditional, because in both the Mexica and the Maya used cacao as offerings as a synonym for human blood. So they weren't always doing human sacrifices and that kind of stuff. They would just give other offerings like jade or rubber or whatever, and they'd use cacao to symbolize blood. It contained that same essence. An oblation standing in for blood and vital organs, and it's the Aztec name or Mexica name, the heart, the blood. It was directly linked to communicating with the ancestors. It was a link to female fertility and reproduction. It was drunk at threshold events such as celebrations, contracts, ceremonies of all sorts, and funerals and everything really. And it was used to protect against snake venom, and water serpents or water spirits were said to desire cacao. And there's also the link to rainbow serpents that I've mentioned already, that possible link. That's just something that I've spotted because the bubbles reflect light in that way. But there was a sort of snaky link. I remember serpents were the vision serpent that connected the realms, analogous to the world tree. Last slide. So just my little summary of some of the themes that have come up for me with cacao. It's like that in terms of the magic of cacao, it's about rebirth, vivifying or revitalizing, fortifying. And this is interesting. A lot of the myths through adversity, if you think about a lot of the myths of it, it's like going into the underworld, and it's like strengthening through difficult times in a way, facilitating transformation. And I think that the homeopathic proving was really interesting, that those drawn to cacao, and there is actually scientific research for this, they found that people who were most drawn to chocolate or identified as chocoholics were much likely to have a higher level of neuroticism. Neuroticism doesn't mean you're crazy, like people think it does. What neuroticism means, the technical definition of neuroticism is sensitivity to negative emotion. So they have a higher sensitivity to negative emotion. So that I thought was fascinating. So I think that those drawn to cacao have high sensitivity to negative emotions. They often feel isolated or unnurtured in some way, may have a personal or family history of exile, such as being scapegoated, rejected, vilified, or othered.
and they may encounter, embody, or expose ancestral trauma. I think those are the functions of cacao. Those are the functions of it.
Oh my god.
So there's a brilliant Cuban phrase called, which I really enjoy, it's called "Toma chocolate, paga lo que debes," which means drink your chocolate and pay what you owe. And it's actually a common phrase just meaning pay your debts, you know, don't fuck people over, that's what it means.
Say that one more time.
Toma chocolate, paga lo que debes. Paga lo que debes. So pay what you owe. Toma chocolate, that's drink chocolate, pay what you owe. Right.
That's very good, actually.
So it's a groovy little phrase, isn't it? So drink chocolate, pay what you owe. So I think it's a medicine for facilitating transformation of ancestral patterns, possibly, and acceptance of mortality and carrying burdens. I often think of Ectuar with his burden of cacao, because a lot of those myths were about going into the underworld or encountering the underworld, then being transformed and reborn. So there's something about cacao, but I think that fear dissolving, pleasure lubricating thing is to open up to that process of encountering scary stuff and enabling yourself to be transformed. I think that's the idea. So, all right.
Yeah.